This happened when I was really young. I'm talking second or third grade. It's hard for me to remember things clearly from that long ago, but this memory stands out for reasons you'll soon understand. It was a school day, and it had been raining cats and dogs all day. After picking me up from school, my parents left the house for some upscale events. I can't remember if it was a fundraiser or a dinner party or something else entirely. Either way, they were supposed to come back home that night, but while they were gone, the storm picked up like crazy, and it became unsafe to drive long distances. So instead of driving back home, they reluctantly decided to spend the night at one of their friends' houses who lived much closer to where the event was. I remember them calling me on the house phone and repeatedly apologizing for leaving me there by myself, even though I insisted that I wasn't even hungry and I'd be fine. My mom gave me a list of things to do before bed. Lock all the doors and windows, keep at least one house light on, make sure all the blinds were closed, typical stuff. At the time, I didn't understand why they were making such a big deal about everything. I wasn't quite old enough to realize how important it was to not leave kids my age home alone. In fact, I was actually kind of excited to have the place to myself. It meant unlimited candy and no bedtime. I obviously didn't have a TV or any kind of screen in my room, so I stayed downstairs in the living room watching TV on the couch. I told myself I'd do all that stuff my mom had requested right before going to sleep, since I was planning on staying up all night anyway. But at some point later in the night, the sugar crash got to me and I accidentally fell asleep. No surprise there. I don't remember exactly what time I ended up waking up, but it was late enough for the TV to have gone into sleep mode, so 3 hours minimum. I distinctly remember being much colder when I woke up. Nothing too out of the ordinary. I mean, temperatures drop at night, but the difference was significant enough for me to instantly make the connection, even at that young age. I thought about just curling back up and going back to sleep, but then I remembered the list my mom had given me. Even at that age, I knew she'd find out if I didn't do it, and I really didn't want to get in trouble after she trusted me to stay home alone. So I forced myself off the couch and went to check the windows and doors. I went around and did everything she asked. Locked the front and back doors, closed all the blinds, checked the windows, even the light. Everything was shut tight, which confused me a little because the house still felt way colder than it should have. I even put my hand against a couple of the windows to make sure they weren't cracked open or something, but they were all sealed. I figured maybe the storm knocked out the heater or something, and I didn't think much more about it. That explanation made sense to me at the time, and I was so tired that I couldn't devote more energy to thinking about the heat. So I headed upstairs to my room, ready to crawl into bed and forget about it. When I got to my room, I finally realized just how bad the storm had gotten. Our living room is tucked into the center of the house, so I hadn't really been able to appreciate the storm from down there. My childhood bedroom has a big external window though, so I could hear everything. The rain was slamming against the glass like it was trying to get in, and every minute or so there was a burst of lightning followed by a deafening clash of thunder. I wasn't scared of storms at that age, but I do remember being concerned that a tree was going to fall on the house. That's probably why I had trouble falling back asleep, even though I had been dead tired not even 20 minutes prior. As I was lying there, trying to fall asleep, I started picking up on these odd sounds. Every so often, there were these weird creaking sounds, like shifting wood. Thing is, the entire floor is carpeted, so it couldn't have been coming from my room. At first, I thought it was a tree swaying in the wind, but the sound didn't quite fit. Even then, I knew the general sounds associated with thunderstorms. This definitely wasn't one of them. It started bothering me after a while. For whatever reason, it wasn't the storm keeping me up. It was that stupid sound. I couldn't take it much longer, so I sat up and looked around the room, not really sure what I was looking for. I listened, trying to drown out the sounds of the storm and focus in on the creaking. Lightning flashed, illuminating the whole room. Everything looked normal, but my eyes were drawn to the only wooden thing in the room, the closet. The room went dark again, and I sat there perfectly still. About a minute later, lightning flashed again, and my room was once again lit up for just a split second. And in that split second, I saw something that made me choke. The closet door was slightly ajar. It had been closed before, I was 100% sure of it. Something had opened it. There was something in my room. I didn't scream, I didn't speak, I didn't even think. I just got out of bed as quietly as I could and walked out of the room. That walk from the bed to the door felt like a 500-mile, 5-year journey. I immediately went downstairs and hid under the dining room table. Then, and only then, I started crying. I didn't know what else to do. There was someone in my house, in my room, and my parents were too far away to help me. I'm not sure how long I stayed under that table, but at one point, I heard footsteps walking down the stairs. I held my breath, knowing that any sound I made could have ended my life. They weren't normal footsteps. It sounded like whatever it was jumping and pinballing down the stairs. The footsteps got closer. They were approaching the dining room table like they knew where I was hiding. I can't tell you how scared I was. I really thought I was gonna die. And then, from under the table, I saw them. I couldn't see their upper body, but two bare feet walked into view. Two nasty, wet, and muddy legs that were tinted yellow. I couldn't tell if they were male or female legs. That's how gross and almost disfigured they looked. There were cuts all over their legs, like they had rolled around in a thorn bush. They were also stumbling, like they were struggling to even stand upright. And just as I thought it couldn't get any worse, they dropped something. It was a wrench. It clattered against the floor, and I'm telling you, it took every fiber in my being to fight back a scream. If that person bent down to pick the wrench up, they'd definitely see me. With wide eyes, I watched as that person stood still, not picking up the wrench, but not walking away either. It felt like a standoff, where any wrong move could end my life. Eventually, they finally continued walking, and I couldn't see them anymore. I listened as the chaotic footsteps stomped and stumbled around my first floor for what felt like an eternity. And then, finally, the front door opened and shut. They were gone. I stayed hidden under that table for a long time after that. Part of it was fear, but another part of it was what I can only describe as trauma. I just remember being shaken and scared. I was at the ripe age where I understood how dangerous the situation was, but not old enough to know how to deal with it. The rest of the night was kind of a blur. I picked the wrench up off the floor, not wanting my parents to find it the next morning. After making sure the front door was locked, I slunked back upstairs, crawled into bed, and fell asleep. Everything went back to normal after that. For whatever reason, I was terrified to tell my parents. I didn't want them to find out I hadn't locked the doors and done everything they had asked me to do, so I just kept the whole thing to myself. It wasn't until several years later that I told them the story, and it actually took some convincing for them to believe me. Looking back, not telling them the moment it happened was an awful decision, since there was nothing that could have been done about it so far removed from the incident. If I'm being frank, this experience traumatized me for basically the rest of my childhood. I slept with a nightlight from then on, and I developed a fear of the dark that didn't go away for a long time. I still have trouble explaining what happened that night, but I learned my lesson. Lock your doors at night. This happened over the course of 3 or 4 years when I was a kid. I can't remember exactly when I got the first one, but I started having this recurring, half-lucid nightmare maybe once every couple of months. From what I can remember, here's how it would go. I'd be lying down in bed, only the view wasn't from my first-person perspective. Instead, I'd be looking down at myself from the ceiling, like I was viewing my own bedroom through a security camera feed. The out-of-body dissociation always freaked me out. I'd try to float or swim towards my body, but I was never able to move beyond swiveling my head to look around the room. I was half lucid, so I knew it was a dream, but that didn't make me any less scared. After calming myself down, I'd start noticing strange things about my bedroom. For one, the digital clock on my nightstand would always be counting in reverse. That was typically the first strange detail I'd notice. And once I noticed that, I'd start seeing other weird stuff. There were these drawings taped to random spots on the walls and dresser, like crayon drawings you'd expect from a kid my age, but I had no memory of ever making them. I wasn't the type of kid who ever drew much, so it wasn't like I had just forgotten about them. They always showed the same thing, a row of people holding hands, all smiling, with one smaller figure who I can only imagine was me. They were always standing in front of a house with a blue roof, but I can't remember much more about the drawings than that. The other detail about the dreams that still sticks out to me is an old toy train of mine that was always sitting in a different spot on my bedroom floor, which was significant because I had lost that particular toy years prior. Anyway, after analyzing my room for a bit, I'd get this unexplainable urge to look out my bedroom window. I'd glance over, and as if it were on cue, a man would appear just a few inches from the glass. He had short gray hair and what looked like a cut on his left temple. That's honestly all I can remember about his face. He would watch me sleep for a few seconds, then start clawing at the window like he was trying to open it from the outside. That's usually when I woke up. Sometimes I immediately ran to the window, and sometimes I was too terrified to even move. But I always ended up checking one way or another. I don't know what I thought I'd find. Maybe claw marks or a smudge from where his hand had been. But there was never anything there, or anyone for that matter. After the fourth time it happened, I finally told my parents. My mom told me that recurring dreams weren't that rare, especially at my age, and my dad chimed in to remind me that they were always just one room away if I ever felt scared. I nodded and acted like that helped, but it didn't. Not really. My dad could tell I was still scared, so he took me by the hand and explored the exterior of the house with me. There was no indication that anyone had been there. No footprints, no smudges on the window, nothing. Even so, that didn't calm my nerves as much as you might think. Keep in mind, this was about 1 year in, so I was having this dream roughly once every 3 months. It wasn't happening every night, not even close, but having the exact same dream 4 times definitely means something, which I knew even at that age. But after that 4th dream though, they just stopped. For a while at least. I went nearly 6 months without a single episode, and at some point, I let myself believe it was over. It all just kind of faded into the background, the way childhood fears tend to when life gets more normal. But then it came back. I have no idea what triggered it, but one random night I had the dream again. Everything was exactly the same as I remembered. The clock, the drawings, the train, everything. But there was something different about that dream that was scaring me twice as much as the earlier ones had. I couldn't figure out what it was. Everything was following the exact same chain of events. But then, as I was looking around the room, I realized what it was. My bedroom window was open. As soon as I saw that, I woke up. There was a period of maybe 5 minutes where I couldn't move, complete and utter sleep paralysis. And it wasn't a passive sleep paralysis either. My brain was screaming at me to check the window the entire time, but I couldn't drag myself out of bed no matter how much I tried. On top of that, I felt significantly colder, as if cold air was blowing through my bedroom window, which I was convinced was wide open. Those 5 minutes were unlike any kind of fear I have ever experienced. All I could think about was how that man was moments away from climbing through my window, yet there was nothing I could do about it. When I finally regained control of my limbs, I forced myself over to the window, confirming that it was locked. I couldn't fall back asleep that night. I was too scared. I'm not sure how I was even able to function the following morning. Another couple of months went by, but I wasn't going to be fooled again. Every night before I went to bed, I thought long and hard about the dream in an attempt to brace myself for having it again. I'm not sure if this logic tracks, but I was hoping that keeping the dream on my brain would help me not get too scared should I have it again. To my surprise, that technique actually worked. The next time I had that dream, I wasn't even half as scared. I didn't even bother checking the window after waking up. By the time I had it again, I was barely scared at all. Still, something about it lingered. Not in a scary way, but enough to make me want to bring it up to my parents again. Maybe it was the way I explained it, or maybe it was because I was slightly older. But for whatever reason, they actually paid closer attention this time. I tried to provide as much detail as possible, something I hadn't done before. As I was getting to my description of the man, my parents' demeanor shifted. Not too dramatically, but enough for me to notice. Specifically, it was right as I was telling them about the cut on his forehead. Before I could even finish, my dad cut me off and asked if I was sure about the cut. I told him I was, and he looked over at my mom like there was some unspoken detail that I wasn't aware of. I asked my parents what was going on, and they assured me that everything was fine. Not wanting to upset them, I didn't inquire further. But from that point on, I started wondering if there was more to the story. As it would turn out, A few days after that conversation, my parents sat me down and came clean. It wasn't some dramatic reveal or anything. They just said there was something they wanted to tell me. My mom did most of the talking. Apparently, when I was really little, like too young to even remember, there was a man named Brian who used to watch me sometimes. They always referred to him as Uncle Brian, but he wasn't actually family, just a close friend of my dad's from college. I guess he was around a lot when I was a baby and a toddler, especially during the times when both my parents were working full-time. But something happened. My dad didn't give details, just said that there was a falling out between them, bad enough that they completely cut ties. He said he forbade Brian from ever coming near our family again, specifically from coming near me again. That was the end of it. I asked what caused the fallout, but they wouldn't tell me. They just repeated that it had nothing to do with me and that I didn't need to worry. The only other thing they told me, and this is what gave me a sick feeling, was that Brian had a noticeable scar on his forehead from a car accident he'd been in years before I was born. They didn't connect the dots out loud, but they didn't have to. I was old enough to make the connection myself. Later that night, after my mom had gone to bed, my dad lingered in the living room with me a little longer. I could tell he wanted to say more, like he hadn't been totally satisfied with how the conversation went earlier. After a few moments of silence, he told me his theory. He said he thought the dreams were my brain's way of processing something buried really deep, some memory from when I was little, before I could even form full sentences. He mentioned how close I apparently used to be with Brian, how I'd cry when he left the house, how I always wanted him to be the one to read me to sleep. My dad said he couldn't think of any other way I'd know about the scar on Brian's forehead. I didn't know what to make of that. I had no recollection of this Brian person whatsoever. Even now, I still can't recall a single memory with him in it. I had no choice but to move on with my life, though, recurring dream or not. Another handful of months passed. I'm doing my best to describe the timeline as accurately as possible, but it's hard to remember exactly how much time passed in between each dream. That said, the frequency decreased after talking to my parents. I had the dream only once or maybe twice within the next year, but things took a very dark turn sometime in year 4. One night after waking up from the dream, I glanced over at my window, just out of habit, and this time, I actually saw something move. It was just a flicker, but I was 100% sure something had just moved from right outside my window, and just like that, all the fear I had spent years trying to prevent came rushing back. It was actually worse. I jumped out of bed and screamed for my parents, who took me very seriously. My dad sprinted outside in his bare feet while my mom held me tightly. Eventually, my dad came back and started whispering stuff to my mom. They told me to stay put while they called the police. I listened to them and stayed in their room, although I don't remember ever hearing any sirens or other voices besides theirs that night. My dad insisted everything was fine and that the police were going to take care of things. The next day, he confessed to me that he had seen what he thought were extremely faint footprints underneath my bedroom window. I asked him if he thought it was Brian, and he said that was impossible, since they had moved and Brian didn't know where we lived. My dad promised me that nothing bad was going to happen ever, and he would turn out to be right. I never had that dream again. My parents don't like talking about this incident, and I can see why. I'm still yet to get a straight answer out of them, but I've since stopped trying. What I can't wrap my head around is the sickening thought that every time I had that dream, there really was someone outside my window watching me. Was it really plausible that someone had been periodically stalking me for 4 years? It doesn't track, and I can't decide what's scarier. If it really was Brian watching me, or just some complete stranger that my brain associated with him for whatever reason. And who knows how that somehow got translated into my dreams. I've done research, and I still don't even know how that would be possible. Maybe he was making a noise or something, and my brain picked up on it. I really can't say. What I can say is that I'm 95% sure my parents never called the police that night. That's something I will likely never get an explanation for. I'll most likely never get any answers regarding this experience since it happened so long ago. But if I do, I'll send an update. This happened a couple of years ago, right before school ended. It was the last day of 8th grade. It was exactly what you'd expect on the final day of middle school. Excitement and bittersweet goodbyes. Everyone was running around, scribbling signatures and cheesy messages in each other's yearbooks. My middle school was huge, easily over 1,000 students, so to keep things manageable, the teachers collected our yearbooks and passed them around to different classrooms, making sure everyone who wanted to got a chance to sign. I'm sure you could see how that could create problems. Anyone who wanted to could write whatever they wanted in anyone's yearbook. The teachers tried their best to prevent things from getting out of hand, but I knew a few kids who wrote some mean messages to people they didn't like. At the end of the day, when I got my yearbook back, I flipped through the pages eagerly, reading all the goofy notes from my friends. But as I scanned the pages, something caught my eye. There was a signature below the face of someone I had never seen before. His name was Samuel Robinson III, a name I'm going to remember for as long as I live. The message he wrote was short, simple, and honestly a bit unsettling. It read, "Hags, I'll be seeing you again." I stared at the page, confused out of my mind. I'd never even spoken a single word to this Samuel kid. It wasn't like there was anything I could do about it, though. The school year was over, so I couldn't see him even if I wanted to. I just chalked it up to some weird kid being weird, or maybe an honest mistake. Either way, I stopped thinking about it. A few hours passed, and before I knew it, I was at home hosting a sleepover in my basement with my best friends Kevin, David, and Kieran. The four of us ate Doritos and played Call of Duty all night. My parents' bedroom was 3 floors above us, so we didn't have to worry much about keeping the noise down. We were messing around on my dad's rowing machine sometime just before 2 when we heard a sharp knock at the storm door. The sound instantly silenced us. Who the hell would knock on the storm door? It must have been someone who either didn't want to wake my parents up, or knew we were down there, or both. It didn't make sense. The person kept knocking in the same rhythmic pattern. I could tell Kieran was about to say something, and I couldn't stop him in time. In a loud and assertive voice, he asked who was there. I wanted to knock him out. He had basically broadcasted to whoever was out there that we were down there. My basement doesn't have any external windows, so it was unlikely that they had known we were down there, but now they did. After a long pause and no more knocking, a muffled voice answered back. He said, "Come around to the back door," in a high-pitched voice that genuinely sounded cheerful, like he was a friend of ours trying to join the sleepover. It was definitely a teenager's voice too, and it didn't sound like someone who was pretending to raise their voice either. I was pretty scared, I can't lie. My friends were seemingly unfazed though, like they thought it was somehow exciting that some random kid was outside my house. They insisted that I at least check it out, and even though I didn't want to, they pressured me into it. We crept upstairs, careful not to make too much noise. I approached the back door slowly, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. Through the narrow glass pane beside it, I could see a shadowy figure standing under the dim light. I got a little closer, and his face came into view. My jaw nearly hit the floor when I realized who it was. It was him. It was that kid Samuel Robinson III who had signed my yearbook. My friends went to go open the door, God knows why, but I stopped them, saying I knew who it was. I explained to them what had happened, and that changed their mood a bit. Keep in mind, Sam was still standing outside while we were talking, and he could definitely see in at us. He must have noticed how freaked out I was, because he started motioning to the side of the house like he wanted me to go over to the window. You might be wondering why none of us were taking this situation more seriously. I honestly think it was because it wasn't like some older, strange man was harassing us. It was a kid from our own school. Still, I wasn't opening the door for him. Instead, I went over to my kitchen window and cracked it open just a tiny bit. My friends followed me and stood a little off to the side. He walked over to the window and I asked him what he wanted, telling him I recognized him from our yearbook. He said, "Oh, so you got my message," and introduced himself as Sam. Then he went on to say he always watched me from afar and that we could have been good friends. I agreed with him just so that I wouldn't piss him off, but there was 0% chance I would have been friends with this kid given any circumstances. I didn't want to press him right away, but I had to know, so I asked him how he knew where I lived. He didn't respond, and I didn't know what to say. Before I could de-escalate the situation, David called him a creepy stalker and told him to piss off. Sam's smile disappeared. He tilted his head like he didn't understand what David had just said. Then, just as quickly, his expression twisted into something I can only describe as hatred. He went from passive and honestly kind of friendly to aggressive and angry. He started screaming things at me, how he hated my friends and thought we should all die, how my ex hated me and random stuff he had no right knowing. He reached toward the window and tried to force it open, but I jammed it shut and locked it. He started snarling at the window and banging on it like an animal. He was 2 seconds away from shattering it, I'm telling you. We must have caused quite the commotion because my parents came rushing down the stairs, demanding to know why we had woken them up. That's when Sam ran away. I told my parents what happened as quickly as I could, and my dad raced outside in his underwear. He came back a few minutes later, saying he had no idea where the kid went. I'm not sure why, but my parents didn't call the police. They just told us to go back to sleep and they deal with the school the following morning, just to give the kid the benefit of the doubt. The next morning, they contacted the school. That's when we learned the disturbing truth. Sam had been expelled a few weeks before the year finished, and he shouldn't have ever been at the school on the last day. Apparently, the yearbooks were printed before his expulsion, which explained why his picture was still included. That meant he had snuck into the school somehow just to write me that message, which freaked me out beyond belief. Despite working with the school to find out more, nobody could track Sam down. It was like he and his parents didn't exist. The whole thing was a pretty big deal, but the school did what they could to keep things under wraps. To this day, I still have no idea how he knew where I lived. That's what freaks me out the most. The running theory is that he was a mentally challenged and troubled young boy who took a strange liking to me for whatever reason, and then he stalked me for who knows how long. My parents were worried for weeks. It's something we don't talk about anymore because it's just uncomfortable, but living in that same house has never felt the same ever since. This happened a decent while ago, back when I was 22. Enough years passed to the point where I feel safe talking about it. I was fresh out of college with a desirable job and minimal expenses since I was living in my childhood home with my parents. Imagine that, racking up considerable savings without having to worry about food or a place to sleep, and all the while having full access to the room I grew up in, my car, and all my hometown comforts. It's safe to say I was living in pure bliss. Believe me, I knew how lucky I was to have parents who allowed me to stay at home and rent free. I know a lot of people don't have that option, so it's something I never took for granted, but not everything was as stress-free as you might think. What I'm about to tell you happened not even 1 month into my time back at home. I've never been what people my age like to call a party girl. I don't drink excessive amounts of alcohol, I don't spend every ounce of my free time at clubs, and I definitely don't allow men to dictate my life in any way. That's just how I was raised. My father is the most important man in my life, and hookup culture disgusts me. Because of all that, my life is pretty routine. Wake up, satisfy my caffeine addiction, go to work, go to the gym, read a bit of my book at home, mess around on my phone, and go to sleep. Weekends are for hiking, mini road trips, board games, and whatever else I decide I want to spend my time doing. But one random weekend, my closest friend from college, Lindsay, invited me and our other 2 friends, Sabrina and Thea, to spend a few days at her family's beach house. I'd never been, but from the way Lindsay talked about it, the place sounded like a dream. Quiet, tucked away from the touristy chaos on its own private beach, and just a short walk from the water. To put it bluntly, Lindsay's family is loaded. I think both her parents were neurosurgeons, so I had a feeling her beach house would be insane, and I was far from disappointed. When I first laid eyes on it, I was awestruck. Look, I'm no architect, but I know a modern style house when I see one, and Lindsay's must have been ultra modern because it looked more like a covert military safe house than a personal home. I'd love to show you guys pictures of it, believe me, I've got plenty, but out of respect for Lindsay's family, I think that would be in really poor taste even if what I'm about to tell you didn't happen. The 4 of us unloaded our stuff and decided where we'd be sleeping. Lindsay obviously had enough individual bedrooms for all of us to occupy, but what would be the fun in that? Instead, the 4 of us stayed in the same room, one of the kids' bedrooms that had 2 sets of bunk beds and its own attached bathroom.
We'd been staying there 3 nights, which, in my opinion, is the perfect amount of time to spend coupled up with anyone other than your family. I tend to be relatively irritable, so anyone who's not clean or polite tends to tick me off pretty easily. Not that any of my friends are, but you know how it is. I know I told you about my relatively boring lifestyle already, but if there was a time to drink, it was that weekend with my friends, so I definitely planned on letting loose a little more than I ordinarily would. We wanted to keep the first night pretty chill though, so we walked down to the private beach connected to the house and sat in the sand, stargazing. The 4 of us were drinking White Claws and listening to house music on Sabrina's speaker when we noticed something in the distance. It was this faint, flickering light emanating from somewhere further down the shore. The 4 of us quieted down a bit and watched the light flicker on and off. The sight was kind of hypnotic, as eerie as it was. After a while, it became clear that the light was swinging back and forth, like a handheld flashlight someone was walking with. And soon after, we realized that's just what it was. It looked like 3 or 4 people casually walking in our direction, not running or stumbling or moving strangely, but strolling at a leisurely pace. As they got closer, we started hearing the sound of laughter, which caused all of us to relax a bit. Considering how late it was most likely just a group of teenagers or even people our age. They must have noticed us because at some point, one of them yelled out hi in a friendly voice. It was a guy's voice, and he sounded around our age. Thea yelled back, and we made some small talk while they made their way over to us. As they approached, we could see that it was a group of 3 guys who looked maybe a year or 2 older than we were. They all had that typical beach boy look, which I could tell right away my friends were digging, especially Thea. She's a bit crazy when it comes to guys, so I can't say I was too surprised. She knows how I feel about her lifestyle, so it's not like I'm saying anything crazy. To be fair, she is drop-dead gorgeous, and I've never seen a guy not take a liking to her. The guys sat down with their beers, and the 7 of us continued drinking. It was actually a really great time. The guys weren't overtly flirtatious, but they weren't boring either. Fast forward an hour and several drinks later, and they ultimately invited us back to their place. Personally, I was exhausted and was leaning towards going to sleep, but I could tell all 3 of my friends wanted to continue hanging out with the boys, especially Thea, of course. I decided not to spoil everyone's fun and called it a night for myself, telling my friends to go on without me. There were only 3 guys after all, and I had no intention of hooking up with anyone that night. I walked back towards Lindsay's house while the 6 of them walked along the beach, presumably towards wherever the guys were staying. I washed up and went to bed. Sometime after 3 in the morning, I woke up to a FaceTime call from Lindsay, which was confusing since she should have either been home by then or asleep next to one of the guys. I answered her in a groggy voice, and what she said woke me up instantly. She basically screamed into the phone that Thea and Sabrina had been kidnapped and I needed to get her car immediately. Her words were like a bucket of ice-cold water being splashed across my face. I've never felt a more intense sense of fear and adrenaline. I didn't waste a second. My hands were literally shaking as I quickly threw on some clothes and sprinted down the stairs. I asked her why she had called me instead of the police, and she reassured me that she already had. She told me to stay on the line as she walked me through it. With her instruction, I managed to open the driveway gate, find her car keys, and speed out of there in a matter of minutes. She told me they were about 10 houses down the beach to the left, so that's where I started driving. She described the car and told me what direction it had gone in, and I slammed on the gas to try and catch up. There wasn't a single car on the road, and I was driving at an insanely unsafe speed. It was a miracle I didn't get pulled over. After a few minutes of driving, I noticed a car matching Lindsay's description driving slowly in the distance. Then I hung up the phone, called the police, and told them exactly where we were. The dispatcher told me to keep my distance so as not to alert them to the situation, so that's what I did. After what felt like forever, I spotted cop lights up ahead. The car ahead of me didn't try to evade the police. I can only imagine that they assumed it was an unrelated stop. I pulled the car over and watched everything unfold. It was pure chaos. The cops forcibly removed all 3 men from the SUV at gunpoint. They put them in cuffs and escorted them back to one of the cruisers. Then, one of the officers walked over to the trunk of the car and pulled it open to reveal both Thea and Sabrina, bound and, from the looks of it, pretty badly bruised. As horrifying as the whole experience was, it was nothing compared to the sequence of events told from their perspective. All three of them were comfortable with me writing this, by the way. We're still close in contact, so I obviously asked them. But none of them wanted to write it themselves, and for good reason. To keep things short, after I went to bed, they all continued drinking. Lindsay is the only one who remembers things clearly, since she was trying to be at least a little responsible given it was her family's house we were staying in. At some point, the guys Thea and Sabrina were with suggested they all go to bed. So the four of them split off while Lindsay told the third guy she was going home. He was really upset about that, which Lindsay initially thought was because he wanted to get with her. She told him she would have been down but had to watch her house, and he got angry. They yelled at each other for a bit, and he ended up telling Lindsay to get the hell out of his house and never come back, which she was more than happy doing. Halfway home though, she realized she had forgotten her purse, so she went back to get it. That's when she saw the guys throwing Thea and Sabrina into the back of the car before driving off. She called the police, then me, and that was that. Thea's parents are both lawyers, and they jumped through dozens of hoops to do two things: keep the event as far away from the public sphere as possible, and make sure those guys got maximum prison sentences. They accomplished both. Turns out the house they were staying in didn't even belong to them. It was owned by some random old couple who were on vacation in a different country. That, plus the slew of other crimes they were charged with, put them away for a long time. Although I still think there's no sentence long enough that can properly compensate for what they did. As much as I hate admitting it, this traumatized me for years. I couldn't do beaches, late nights, or talking to strangers, no matter how harmless they seemed, or how safe a situation felt. I became antisocial and drifted away from the girls for a little, but luckily that's since changed. I can't even begin to imagine how this incident affected Thea and Sabrina. Part of me feels like not remembering anything is a blessing in disguise. I think the craziest part about the whole thing is the fact that had I not gone home, I might not have been able to reach Lindsay's car in time. And had it not been for that, the police may have never found those guys' car.
This happened just last year. My buddy Jimmy is pretty involved and well connected within the music community. By music community, I'm more specifically referring to the dance/electronic music scene all along the East Coast, predominantly New Jersey and New York. It's actually pretty impressive what he and his team have been able to accomplish in just 2 years. The general gist is this: their company hosts what they call events at high-profile venues, typically the most well-known club or party space in whatever city they happen to be in. Then they outsource the talent, which, mind you, is typically a very well-known and sometimes borderline famous DJ. I'm not too involved or invested in that scene, so I'm not exactly sure who they've gotten to perform, but I will tell you that there have been some huge names in the mix. But enough context. Jimmy and I go way back. I'm talking 20 plus years. I've basically known him my entire life, and he's been my best friend for damn near most of it. Because of that, he lets me, along with a bunch of our other hometown friends, come to his shows for free and hang out with the talent in the VIP section. It's actually really cool, and something I wish I expressed my gratitude for more often. Jimmy was scheduled to host a huge event the weekend of July 4th on the Jersey Shore. It was going to be their biggest one yet, and all our mutual friends were going. Jimmy invited me to come down early with him, and I obviously obliged. The two of us made the hour-and-a-half drive with our other friend Ryan, and we found ourselves at the venue a good 4 hours before the doors opened. Ryan and I didn't have much to do while Jimmy and his team set up, so we decided to get a bit of a head start on the alcohol consumption. Jimmy and his team were entitled to as much free booze as they desired, compliments of the venue, and Ryan and I definitely took advantage of that. By the time the first DJ started his set, Ryan and I were more than a little buzzed, to put it mildly. It was 4th of July weekend after all, so we felt like our degenerate activities were justified. Fast forward a couple hours, and Ryan and I were completely wasted. I honestly don't remember a time since then when I was that drunk, not even close. Don't get me wrong, Ryan and I are grown men and we can handle our alcohol. Throwing up, making fools of ourselves wasn't the issue though. It was genuinely just the problem of having lower impulse control and worse decision making. But either way, we were having a great time, at least from what I can remember. The event was winding down, and it was getting to that point in the night where you either figured out how you were getting home or who you were going home with, or both.
Jimmy had rented an Airbnb really close by and promised both Ryan and I a bed, so the first issue wasn't a concern. The second problem, though, that was what was on my mind. The two of us danced over to the bar and started talking to some girls we found attractive, and before long, we had figured out who we were going to spend the rest of the night with. Neither of us are Calvin Klein models, but we're both above 6 feet tall. For whatever reason, the vast majority of guys who hang around the Jersey Shore are usually shorter than average, so being tall is an even bigger boost than it usually is. And for whatever reason, that seems to be the main attribute most girls on the Jersey Shore seek out. Not looks, not build, not intelligence, but height. Don't ask me why. The Jerseyan female mind is still something I have yet to comprehend. I'm probably botching their names, but I'm fairly sure the two girls introduced themselves as Gianna and Marcela. Us meeting them coincides with where my ability to recall events precisely becomes a bit hazy, so there may be gaps in the story from here on out. From what I can remember, it was actually Marcela who suggested we all leave together and continue to party elsewhere, which Ryan and I weren't going to argue with. Gianna handed the two of us a drink and insisted that we get on their level before heading out, even though we had both probably consumed the fluid equivalent of her body weight in alcohol already. I know that whole dynamic. Girls getting guys drinks sounds a little unorthodox, and it is, but these girls were clearly wealthy given how they were dressed. After downing the drinks, the four of us started moving towards the venue's exit. The moment we stepped outside, Marcela suggested we go back to her place, which was pretty close by and also right on the beach. Her saying that actually surprised me a little. I was fully anticipating going back to our Airbnb, considering the guys were usually the ones to host in situations like this. But both girls insisted that Marcela's beach house was definitely nicer than whatever inland Airbnb we found for the night. She had a point, so I didn't argue, and neither did Ryan. We walked along the beach, talking the whole time. The girls seemed really intelligent and knowledgeable based on the conversations we had, and I remember finding it so refreshing to talk about something other than nightlife and whatever other garbage I'm used to talking to girls about for once. Not just girls, drunk people in general. At one point, I actually felt kind of embarrassed for being so drunk because I felt like I couldn't articulate myself well enough and looked like an idiot. That's when I realized I actually was feeling drunker than I had been 15 minutes earlier. But it wasn't a drunk I was used to feeling. I felt like my body was melting under my weight, as if I were going to collapse uncontrollably any second. My legs felt flimsy, almost like cardboard, if that makes any sense. Moving my limbs, mouth, and even my eyes became increasingly more difficult, and there was a moment where my extremities started feeling a little numb. But then, just as quickly as the feeling arose, it passed, back to normal drunkenness, at least for the time being. Just then, we arrived at the beach house. It was insane. I'm probably exaggerating because I was so drunk, but it looked like what I imagined a professional athlete's beach house to look like. We went inside, and after taking our shoes off, found ourselves in what I'm guessing was a living room. I say guessing because the level of opulence in there was just so foreign to anything I'm used to. It was decorative, but somehow minimalistic. Even those descriptions are opposite. There were honest-to-God sculptures on pedestals in there, but it didn't feel cluttered or overly showy, and everything on display seemed to blend right into the walls like they were just extensions of the room. I wish I had the wherewithal to take a picture, but again, my mind was elsewhere. Evidently, so was Ryan's, because not 15 minutes after stepping foot in the house, he and Marcela had disappeared somewhere in that maze of a house, which left me alone with Gianna. She leaned in to kiss me, and that's the last thing I remember before blacking out. Not her kissing me, but leaning in to kiss me. That's where everything cuts off. I don't remember feeling woozy again or drinking more or doing anything else, but there's a huge gap in my memory that spans several hours and will not come back no matter what I try. And the thing is, I know I didn't pass out because there are texts on my phone sent from me proving I was still conscious. There's digital proof that I was sentient, but I don't remember one bit of it. And before you say I just simply blacked out from alcohol, this was different. I rarely ever black out, but all the times I have, I can still remember bits and pieces of the night, scattered moments here and there, enough for me to string together a continuous sequence of events at the very least. Keep in mind, those were also all times where I was drunker than I was that night, so that's another reason I think a generic blackout isn't a reasonable explanation for what happened. Plus, Ryan experienced the exact same thing at essentially the exact same time, which is way too specific to be coincidental. Here's the next thing I remember. Waking up with the sun directly overhead in a random set of bushes over an hour away from where the event was. Something I didn't know yet because my phone wasn't in my pocket. In fact, nothing was in my pocket at all. Both my wallet and keys were gone, but it gets worse. It wasn't even my pocket to begin with. I was wearing someone else's clothes, and not Ryan's either, a complete stranger's. The only personal belonging of mine I still had in my possession was my shoes, and even those were messed up. Both shoes had the shoelaces removed and were soaking wet. My head was pounding, and everything felt disoriented, like I was waking up from anesthesia. I didn't even sit up right away. I just stared at the sky for a minute, trying to make sense of where I was. Bushes, someone else's clothes, no wallet, no phone, no keys. Based on my shoes, it was like I had been in the water recently, but it didn't smell like salt water or chlorine. The worst part about the whole thing was the blankness. I genuinely couldn't remember anything past Gianna leaving, like I already said. That's when the panic started to creep in. I wasn't just hungover, I was scared. I had no idea how I got there. What if I'd gotten into a fight or crashed a car? What if someone drugged me? I didn't have a single point of reference for the last 10 hours. I stood up and realized there wasn't a single landmark around me. It didn't look like a beach town, which also scared me. The road ahead just curved into more trees, but just across the street, maybe a few hundred feet away, was a 7-Eleven. It was genuinely the only thing in sight, so I headed straight for it. I asked the guy behind the counter if I could use his phone, telling him that mine had been stolen. He stared at me for a second, probably debating whether or not I was trying to scam him, but then he slid it across the counter. The first number that came to my mind was my sister's. It was the only number besides my mom or dad's I still memorized, and there was no way in hell I was calling my parents. My sister picked up right away, and I tried explaining things the best I could. She ended up giving me Ryan's number, which I ended up calling several times, but to no avail. That's when I started wondering if what had happened to me happened to him too. Drugged, robbed, dumped in some random bushes an hour away. I was just about to call the police, when what do you know, Ryan walks into the same 7-Eleven. We just stared at each other for a second before dabbing each other up. He then told me his version of things, and you guessed it, it was the same story, damn near exactly. That sealed it for us. We called the police, making sure to thank the 7-Eleven worker profusely. Fast forward a few minutes, and we're now recounting our story to the police outside the store. To their credit, they took everything we said seriously, at first. But the more we told them, the more their questions started turning. Were we sure we didn't just drink too much? Maybe we wandered off and passed out somewhere. They weren't accusing us outright, but it was clear they weren't entirely convinced something criminal happened. I told them it was unlikely we would have drunkenly wandered into a town an hour away by foot, and I don't think they liked that remark very much. I gave them my sister's number and asked them to call her. She was already tracking my phone through Find My iPhone. To all of our collective surprise, my phone was showing up in the middle of a parking lot a few minutes' drive away. The officers agreed to drive us, and sure enough, both our phones were sitting on the pavement next to each other. While it was great to have my phone back, that only affirmed the police's theory that we had just been drunk. They started saying that we probably hadn't even been robbed, that we had lost our wallets the same way we had lost our phones. We tried convincing the police to check out the house Marcela brought us to, the one she claimed was hers, but they weren't having it. They told us we were probably just too drunk and didn't remember things correctly. One of them even said, "It happens more than you think." Then they gave us their cards and told us to call if we remembered anything else. It was actually shocking how reluctant they were to even connect us to other officers that would be willing to help. They told us to find a ride home since our phones were still charged, and they just left us there. After they left, I went through my phone for the first time, and things got even weirder. There were texts sent from me to a ton of people I knew. Jimmy, my parents, a few coworkers, even some girls I had been talking to. All normal sounding stuff. Stuff I might have said if I had actually had a calm, coherent night. The texts genuinely sounded like me, but from a continuity standpoint, they didn't make any sense when considered all together. One message to Jimmy thanked him for the event and said we'd crashed at a buddy's place. One to my dad said we were safe and had found a couch to sleep on. There was another to a girl I'd been texting that just said something casual, like I was hanging out at home and thinking about her. None of those texts made any sense, and mostly contradicted each other. I realized I had a ton of missed calls and texts from Jimmy, so I called him. He sounded relieved to hear from me, saying he thought Ryan and I had died or something. He told us to stay put, he'd come pick us up. In the meantime, Ryan and I canceled all our cards, but interestingly, none of them had been used, despite the likely fact that they had been in those girls' possession for several hours. The entire ride home, we talked non-stop about what could have happened. None of it made any sense. Yeah, we had been drugged, that much was clear, but that didn't explain things. First of all, I don't know of any kind of roofie that has those effects, like an induced blackout. Everything I've read just said those drugs make you fall asleep, but again, I was conscious, as the texts confirm. Plus, why go to such lengths just to rob two random guys? Especially if you weren't going to at least even attempt to use their credit cards. Two guys who walked up to you, no less. And in such a risky place too, your own house. Or was it a house they had broken into? Both were equally risky. Jimmy thought we had been targeted, but like I just said, we had been the ones to approach the girls, so we couldn't have been targeted. And all this isn't even mentioning how or why we miraculously found ourselves in a random town an hour away wearing other people's clothing. As crazy as it sounds, both Ryan and I checked ourselves for incisions, thinking maybe some of our organs had been harvested, but there was nothing. Jimmy suggested that maybe they had just given us some exotic drugs, which I guess makes sense, but someone had driven us to that town, and someone other than those girls had switched clothes with us. We never got an answer, but it's not like we just forgot about the whole thing. Ryan and I ended up driving all the way back to the shore just to go looking for that house. We tried our best to retrace our steps, knowing that if we just walked along the boardwalk, we'd eventually find the house, since it was on the beach. And we actually did find it. The two of us walked up the walkway and rang the doorbell. An older man opened the door, asking us what we wanted. I did the talking. Not wanting to reveal too much or potentially incriminate myself, I simply asked him if a girl named Marcela lived here, or if he had a daughter or granddaughter around our age. He gave me a hard no, and I made up some BS story that there was a girl who lied about owning this house, which he actually found pretty funny. Then that was that. I would be lying if I said I didn't walk away from that house with a sick, unsettling feeling in my stomach. I can't even describe it as fear, just a sickening discomfort, like something truly awful had happened to me and my friend that night, and I'd never get to the bottom of it. For a long time after that, I was convinced those girls had been involved in something much, much bigger that neither me nor Ryan could even conceive. That maybe they had been planning to kidnap or kill us, and decided not to go through with it at the last second for whatever reason. I know I'll never have an update, but if something else happens, I'll definitely send something.